I go into these stories with a great deal of ignorance. What I thought would be a biography of a man became a biography of a city. When I first heard of Orban, he seemed like an endlessly fascinating and unbelievably consequential biographical subject. However, except for his brief yet significant appearance on the world stage, almost nothing is known about him. And so, since I have no points to make or any arguments to win, or no overarching narrative to weave with this little history show, I simply let the subjects take me where they will. In researching Orban, he took me on a journey of learning about one of the most cataclysmic events in the history of mankind. Many may know the story of the fall of Constantinople. Others may simply know only that it fell to the Ottomans at some point in history. Count me in that latter category. But I think few people have had the opportunity to view the street view mode of its fall, and what it looked like for the individuals involved. Author and historian Roger Crowley grants us a magnificent glimpse of these events. A podcaster, a history podcaster, could not ask for a finer source. And so, let's learn a little bit about the greatest city ever built, and the man who brought about not only its demise, but changed the world forever. Orban, the taker of the city. From the flaming and flashing of certain igneous mixtures, and the terror inspired by their noise, wonderful consequences ensue which no one can guard against or endure. When a quantity of this powder, no bigger than a man's finger, be wrapped up in a piece of parchment and ignited, it explodes with a blinding flash and a stunning noise. If a larger quantity were used, or the case were made of some more solid material, the explosion would be much more violent, and the flash and noise altogether unbearable. End quote. 13th century Franciscan philosopher Roger Bacon. The site of Constantinople was chosen by Constantine himself in AD 324 as the new seat of power for the new Rome. Its location was strategic and symbolic, nestled on the easternmost part of Europe between the Aegean and the Black Seas and overlooking a thin waterway that's probably the most internationally significant piece of real estate in the history of the world, known as the Bosphorus. This waterway was the highway of trade and geopolitics between the two worlds, between Europe and Asia, between the West and the East. Unimaginable quantities of treasure and gold flowed through these straits, along with endless rivers of commodities, caviar, wax, salt, spices, ivory, amber, pearls, slaves. To the south, the entire Middle East could be accessed: Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad. To the west, through the Dardanelles, the whole of Mediterranean society: Italy, Sicily, Crete. Egypt and the mighty Nile Valley. By land, all of Greece. Constantine's personal touch was everywhere on the city. The vast grids of streets and grand government buildings, magnificent public gardens, the hippodrome, adorned with stolen artifacts from ancient Greece, and peppered throughout this great new city were, as it said, imperial palaces and churches more numerous than the days in the year. But Constantinople's two greatest features came a few generations after Constantine established his city. The first, actually started by Constantine, yet named for the emperor who finished them, the walls of Theodosius. For 1,000 years, these walls were the most formidable defense in all the medieval world. I'm using the word walls rather loosely. They were, in fact, an enormous 200-foot-thick series of defensive structures. An enemy army approaching Constantinople would first have encountered a huge moat fed by the seas on either side. Then, 60 feet beyond the moat, was a 20-foot-high wall complete with parapets and towers. And then beyond that wall, after another 60 feet, was a second wall 40 feet high with even larger towers that overlooked the moat and the killing fields 100 feet below. The towers were built unattached to the wall so that in the event that a trebuchet or a catapult took one of them out, its collapse wouldn't rip down a part of the wall with it. The walls themselves were made from mortar and limestone, quarried from the hills surrounding the city, making short order of maintenance and repairs. From these towers, huge boulders and Greek fire, which we'll get to a little bit later, could be cast upon the foolhardy who would dare attack the seat of power in the new Rome. With the walls stretching for nearly 4 miles from sea to sea, the city was impregnable by land, and the peninsula's coasts were well guarded by yet more walls and the formidable Byzantine navy. The only way in or out of the city was through a series of gates along the walls, each bearing its own unique name. The principal of these gates was the Golden Gate. This ceremonial entrance of polished marble had seen wonders pass through it. The great and terrible emperors of Byzantium led through this gate, defeated rulers of nations bound in chains, wild beasts rare and unseen by Europeans before, barbarian slaves of the East, all manner of treasure and booty, and priceless relics that were eternally sacred to Christendom. The walls of Theodosius guarded not only the city of Constantinople, but Europe too. As long as the city stood, as long as the sleepless guards were at their watch on its great towers, scanning the horizon for the enemies of Christ, Europe was safe from the followers of the prophet. It was a blockade against Islam, or, as the city was called in Muslim countries at the time, a bone in the throat of Allah. But as Europe grew used to the presence of the city, they also grew complacent. The book, 1453 by Roger Crowley, describes the deep significance of the walls of Constantinople. Quote, "The continuous life of the wall was so long that a deep accretion of history, myth, and half-forgotten associations attached to the various sectors. There was hardly a place that had not witnessed some dramatic moment in history, scenes of terrible treachery, miraculous deliverance, and death. Through the Golden Gate, Heraclius brought the true cross in 628. The Gate of the Spring saw the stoning of the unpopular Emperor Nicephorus by an enraged mob in 967, and the restoration of the Orthodox emperors after Latin rule in 1261, when the gate was opened from within by sympathizers. The dying Emperor Theodosius II was carried through the 5th military gate in 450 following a fall from his horse in the valley outside, while the gate of the wooden circus was blocked up in the 12th century after a prophecy that the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa would use it to capture the city. If the church was their vision of heaven, the wall was their shield against the battering of hostile forces, under a personal protection of the Virgin herself. People saw visions of guardian angels on the ramparts, and emperors inserted marble crosses and prayers into the outward-facing walls. Near the center point of the wall, there was a simple talisman that expressed Constantinople's deepest fear. It said, "O Christ God, preserve your city undisturbed and free from war. Conquer the fury of the enemy." End quote. And this brings us to the second of Constantinople's two greatest features, the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Commissioned by the inexhaustible Emperor Justinian and completed in 537, the Hagia Sophia was a miracle of engineering. It was an enormous and magnificently beautiful work of art, the whole thing. Intricate mosaics of gold and jewels covered nearly every square inch. The vaulted ceilings alone accounted for 4 acres of handcrafted mosaics depicting the hosts of heaven. The entire church was capped with a dome 100 feet wide and described by the thoroughly impressed Byzantine historian and contemporary Procopius, quote, "It seems not to rest upon solid masonry, but to cover the space beneath as though suspended from heaven." End quote. The immense beauty of it all left men utterly speechless. When Vladimir the Great of Kiev was in search of a national religion to bind together the Russian people, he sent emissaries to investigate the largest religions of the time. Upon their return from witnessing the divine liturgy of the Hagia Sophia, they said, quote, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or earth, for on earth there is no such splendor and beauty, and we are at a loss of how to describe it. We only know that there God dwells among men." End quote. The Orthodox Christian religion was everything to everyone in this city. It was a centrifugal force to everything they did, no matter how mundane. One rather annoyed foreign visitor said, quote, "The city is full of workmen and slaves who are all theologians. If you ask a man to change money, he will tell you how the Son differs from the Father. If you ask the price of a loaf, he will argue that the Son is less than the Father. If you want to know if the bath is ready, you are told that the Son was made out of nothing." End quote. The Virgin Mary was the divine protector of the city, and in times of great need, when the enemy was at their doorstep, as it so often was, her icons were marched along the city walls. All reliance for safety was in her loving maternal hands. On any given day, massive groups of nuns and monks from any of the various monasteries were busily tolling bells in the streets or praying under raised domes. Endless parades of icons and ceaseless worship filled the city air. Throughout the liturgical calendar, fasting, feast days, and all-night vigils made up the structure of Byzantine life. A Russian visitor who witnessed an imperial coronation in the Hagia Sophia was bewildered by the splendor. Quote, "The cantors intoned a most beautiful and astonishing chant, surpassing understanding. The imperial cortege advanced so slowly that it took 3 hours from the great door to the platform bearing the throne. 12 men-at-arms, covered with mail from head to foot, surrounded the emperor. Before him marched 2 standard-bearers with black hair. The poles of their standards, their costume, and their headdress were red. Before these standard-bearers went heralds. Their rods were plated with silver. Ascending the platform, the emperor put on the imperial purple, the imperial diadem, and the crenated crown. Then the Holy Liturgy began. Who can describe the beauty of it all?" End quote. At its height, Constantinople housed 1 million people, and it had the prestige and inheritance of the Roman Empire. It had the premier currency of the East, and it had the spiritual envy of the West. For within its hallowed halls were priceless relics. The head of John the Baptist, the crown of thorns, nails from the true cross, the stone from Christ's tomb, relics from the apostles, and hundreds of others. Priest and chronicler the Fulcher of Chartres says of Constantinople, quote, "Oh, what a splendid city! How stately, how fair, how many monasteries therein, how many palaces raised by sheer labor in its broadways and its streets, how many works of art, marvelous to behold! It would be wearisome to tell of the abundance of all good things, of gold and silver, garments of manifold fashion, and such sacred relics. Ships are at all times putting in at this port, so that there is nothing that men want that is not brought thither." End quote. It was truly the city of the world's desire. In fact, to the rest of the world, it was simply known as the city. And the world of Islam had dreamed of capturing it ever since the Prophet. As long as the city had existed, siege had always darkened its door. Brave Islamic leaders, each one believing themselves to be the one who would finally bring home the red apple, the Turkish metaphorical name for the seat of Western power. But to label the city's enemies as Turkish is probably too simplistic, and likewise to say the inhabitants of Constantinople were Greek or Byzantine is also too generic. For most of history for the Turks and the Byzantines, neither people would really understand those names. The term Byzantine wasn't even used until around 1850. For the Byzantines, they considered themselves to be Roman, actual and legitimate heirs of the Roman Empire. To them, the Muslim Turks were faithless, heathens, or pagans. The Turks, in turn, would have called the Byzantines infidels, wretched unbelievers, and enemies of the faith. Make no mistake about it, the conflicts between Constantinople and pretty much the rest of the world was about religion. Between the Muslims to the east and the Latins to the west. There's no way to understand the city's geopolitical situation without understanding its religious situation. Prior to the events that I'm leading up to here, and since its founding, the city had been under siege 23 times, averaging about 2 sieges a century throughout its existence. Hardly a generation would have passed that hadn't been able to gaze into the horizon of the setting sun and see an army of soldiers hell-bent on pillaging, determined to devastate everything they hold dear. Of those 23 sieges, the city fell only once, ironically, to Frankish knights of the Fourth Crusade, but more on that later. Apart from its surpassing defensive infrastructure and commanding natural advantages, a major reason why Constantinople survived constant attacks was its military engineers, a holdover from the Western Empire. The sailors of an enemy fleet that was charged with attacking the city had one fear upon them: Greek fire. Its first use appeared on the record in 674, and its exact composition is still unknown due to its ingredients and methodology being a Byzantine state secret. But somehow, Constantinople's fleet in the Bosphorus was able to pressurize some mixture of oil and perhaps sawdust and other ingredients to make the mixture stickier. And then something like a fire hose would blast this ignited mixture across the sea, setting ablaze enemy ships. The water itself would carry tides of this floating hellfire to the ships that were still out of range and completely engulfing them and consuming them. Greek fire always crushed the morale of the Arab ships. They didn't know how to make it, and they had no defense against it. Another strength of Byzantium was its leadership. They were expert diplomats, perhaps by necessity. In 717, the city was under siege from yet another Turkish army under the leadership of another one of those men who thought that they would be the one, a man named Maslama. Emperor Leo II was in a bad spot and needed a Hail Mary pass to save his starving and surrounded people. So he sent a message to Maslama telling him that he would gladly hand the city over to him, but he would be unable to convince the populace of such a move. Perhaps, if Maslama handed over all of his army's food to the citizenry, they would embrace him as their savior. Maslama agreed and delivered the food and waited for the gates to swing open, but they never did. And then Leo II ghosted him, refusing any of Maslama's emissaries. As winter set in, the Arabs, unused to the cold, became miserable. Without food, some resorted to cannibalism, and many, many more died from disease. Simultaneously, through another diplomatic channel, Leo had negotiated for the pagan Bulgars to come and march their army in and attack Maslama's forces, killing another 11,000, it's said. And as Maslama retreated across the Marmara Sea, an underwater volcano erupted, boiling the sea waters and disintegrating his ships, entirely eliminating the would-be survivors of his doomed campaign. For over 1,000 years, Muslim martyrs died before the walls of the city, the bone in the throat of Allah. With so much death over such a span of time, lore and myth arose before the walls. One prophecy is attributed to the prophet himself. Quote, "In the jihad against Constantinople, 1/3 of Muslims will allow themselves to be defeated, which Allah cannot forgive. 1/3 will be killed in battle, making them wondrous martyrs, and 1/3 will be victorious." End quote. I mentioned earlier that for Muslims, the metaphorical symbol of the power of the West was known as the red apple. It's a hard concept to pin down exactly, but it was a term used again and again as a rallying cry of conquest for the Muslim world. Some believe the Red Apple had an actual physical location inside the city, and its capture would render to Islam the untold riches and conversion of the West. The Red Apple was thought to be in the firm grasp of Emperor Justinian, or the statue of Justinian. It was actually a globe, and it lay in front of the doors of the Hagia Sophia. Quote, "The horse faces east, and is a noble sight. On this horse is a huge statue of the emperor, dressed like Achilles. His breastplate is in the heroic style, with the helmet covering his head, and it seems to move up and down, and it gleams dazzlingly. He looks towards the rising sun, riding, it seems to me, towards the Persians. In his left hand he carries a globe, the sculptor signifying by this that all the earth and sea are subject to him, though he has neither sword nor spear nor weapon, except that on the globe stands the cross, through which, alone, he has achieved his kingdom and his mastery of war." End quote. So, the Persians, or more specifically, the Turks and the Ottomans who replaced them, who were they and what's the difference? Historian Roger Crowley credits the Turks with reawakening the spirit of jihad once they all converted to Islam. Originally, they were a roving group of pagan Asian steppe dwellers, and typical of people from this region, they loved the combination of composite bows and horse warfare. Of these people who erupted out of the Asian steppe, one historian says, quote, "Sedentary people have become used to laziness and ease. They find full assurance in the safety of the walls that surround them and the fortifications that protect them. The Bedouins have no gates and walls. They always carry weapons. They watch carefully all sides of the road. They take hurried naps only when they are in the saddle. They pay attention to every faint barking noise. Fortitude has become a character quality of theirs, and courage their nature." End quote. Once these nomads encountered Islam, they quickly converted. Crowley says, quote, "The spirit of militant Islam suited the Turkish fighting spirit perfectly. The desire for plunder was legitimized by pious service to Allah." End quote. Moving further west, and now with jihad spurring them on, they reached Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, east of the Bosphorus, Byzantine territory. In 1071, the Byzantine Emperor Romanus marched out to meet the horde of nomads and was surprised to find them led by a sultan. And then he was even more surprised to find that he had been utterly crushed in battle. By the end of it, he was forced to kiss the ground in front of the sultan, who planted his foot firmly upon Romanus's neck to further drive home the symbolic gesture. This became known as the Battle of Manzikert, and it was an abject disaster for Byzantium. Anatolia was lost to the forces of the East forever, along with all the vital resources and military conscriptions. The Ottomans come into focus a little bit later. They were one of these nomadic Turkish tribes, the tribe of Osman, their namesake, but no one is even really sure who Osman was. Going back to Crowley, he says, quote, "They emerged from among the anonymous wandering Turkmen sometime around 1280. A caste of illiterate warriors living among tents and wood smoke, who ruled from the saddle and signed with a thumbprint, and whose history was subsequently restructured by imperial myth-making." End quote. Speaking of myth-making, there's a legend that Osman once had a dream that his people would be the ones to conquer the city. Fast forward to the 15th century, the Ottomans rule Turkey and are on the verge of becoming an empire. Even though they were technically Turkish Muslims, they were surprisingly multicultural. Their best troops were Slavs, their best general was a Greek, their admiral was a Bulgarian, their own sultan may have even been Macedonian. Even thousands of Byzantine Christians marched with the Ottomans in times of war due to various vassalages. As it is with all things in this fleeting world of ours, glory does not last forever. At a time when the Latins and the Byzantines needed to be unified most of all, they could not have worked harder at making a bad situation worse. Pope Urban II plunged Western Europe into 350 years of crusades into the Holy Land with a single sermon, and the ideal stopover for these armies was the city of Constantinople. The Crusaders, inept in combat, divided in leadership, ill-equipped for desert warfare, and repeatedly handed defeat after defeat, demanded support and sustenance from the emperors of the city. Crowley says, quote, "Contact brought mutual incomprehension and distrust. Each side had the opportunity to observe closely differences in custom and forms of worship. The Greeks came to see their heavily mailed Western brethren as little more than uncouth barbarian adventurers. Their mission, a hypocritical exercise in imperial conquest disguised as piety. End quote. The Frankish Crusaders, for their part, saw the Byzantines as, quote, dangerously oriental, and were aghast that they would allow Turkish troops, members of the vile race, as Pope Urban put it, to serve in the city dedicated to the Virgin. By the time the Fourth Crusade had come around, relations between the East and the West churches were at an all-time low. This Fourth Crusade was supposed to capture the Holy Land by first conquering Egypt, but its leaders went rogue, and in a last-minute audible, they decided to sack the city of Constantinople instead. It was claimed to be a move of vengeance for an earlier massacre against Latins in the city. The result of the sack was wanton plunder and death. They terrorized the people and set the city on fire. They tore down statues. Priceless works of art made from solid bronze were melted down. Men were murdered. Women, as well as nuns, were raped. Byzantine chronicler Nicetas recounts how they desecrated the Hagia Sophia. Quote, "They brought horses and mules into the church to better carry off the holy vessels and the engraved silver and gold that they had torn from the throne and the pulpit, and the doors and the furniture, wherever it was to be found. And when some of these beasts slipped and fell, they ran them through with their swords, fouling the church with their blood and odor." End quote. The Frankish knights, crusaders, holy warriors, men who considered themselves the pinnacle of chivalry, behaved like unintelligible beasts set loose upon a defenseless quarry. Nothing was sacred to them. When news reached Pope Innocent III of the disaster, he disowned the Crusaders. For the next 60 years, the city was placed under French rule, and its imperial landholdings were divided up among the victors. Eventually, though, the Byzantines managed to recapture their beloved city, only to find it in a state of forlorn disrepair. As the Byzantines began the long process of rebuilding their home from both metaphorical and literal rubble, just a few short miles across the Bosphorus, the Ottomans were cementing themselves as a new, formidable geopolitical power. The waxing and waning of Ottoman and Byzantine hegemony became an inescapable fact in 1284 when, due to the loss of territory which led to empty imperial coffers, the emperor was forced to disband the city's navy. And all of those suddenly employed sailors found stable work just over the Bosphorus with the Ottomans, who were badly in need of experienced seamen as they were trying to build their own respectable navy. Then came that infamous 14th century of human misery. And Constantinople was no exception to the sufferings of the world at this time. Though not the first plague that ravaged the city, the Black Death was awful for the people who were already suffering from the usual hardships of a civilization past its prime. It's estimated that half of the city's inhabitants died. I mentioned that the city was accustomed to plagues and even more accustomed to ceaseless siege tactics, but there's another phenomenon of the cruel world of ours that it was also acquainted with: earthquakes. The city was built on a huge fault line. After the plague wrought its devastation, a massive series of earthquakes rocked the city hard enough to bring down the dome of the Hagia Sophia itself. The years of calamity was taking its toll, for the once great city was now a shadow of its former self. One contemporary Spanish visitor noted the Hagia Sophia was, quote, "in such a state that both it and the city show well the evils which the people have suffered and still endure. The city is sparsely populated, the inhabitants are not well clad, but sad and poor, showing the hardship of their lot." End quote. In his book, 1453, Roger Crawley describes the city as shrinking inside its walls like an old man in the clothes of its youth, and the emperors were paupers in their own house. At a 14th century imperial coronation, the crown jewels were observed to be mere glass gems, the banquet plates now made of clay and pewter, as the riches of Byzantium had all been pawned off. There's just something so sad about that. What's worse, the city's ever-present enemy who ceaselessly desired the red apple of the West was not some barbarian rabble, but the pinnacle of contemporary military organization. A French traveler visiting the Ottomans had this to say of them, quote, "They are diligent, willingly rise early and live on little. They are indifferent as to where they sleep, and they usually lie on the ground. Their horses are good, cost little in food, gallop well, and for a long time. Their obedience to their superiors is boundless. When the signal is given, those who are to lead march quietly off, followed by the others with the same silence. 10,000 Turks on such an occasion will make less noise than 100 men in Christian armies. I must own that in my various experiences I have always found the Turks to be frank and loyal, and when it was necessary to show courage, they have never failed to do so." End quote. Murad II, the Sultan of the Ottomans, died in 1452, and though in life he was many times an enemy to the city and Christianity in general, he was at least a known quantity. Greek chronicler Ducas noted, quote, "The treaties that he had sworn sacredly with the Christians he had always kept intact. His anger was short-lived, and he was averse to warfare and keen on peace, and for this reason the Father of Peace rewarded him with a peaceful death, rather than being dispatched by the sword." End quote. Though, like I said, he was still their enemy. In 1430, he sacked the second largest city in Byzantium, Thessaloniki, where he subjected the city to pillage and plunder, and his army made off with 700 women and children to be sold as slaves. The new Sultan, Murad's son, was Mehmed II, and he was only 17 when he took the reins of the Ottomans, and thus Europe generally considered him to be too young and inexperienced to be much of a threat. Upon his ascendancy, he had to take the dirty and age-old task of securing his throne by eliminating any possible rivals, and so he had his infant brother drowned in his bathtub. Constantinople sent emissaries to greet the new sultan and were surprised to find that they were warmly welcomed in his house. The young sultan even swore upon the Prophet, the Koran, and the angels that he would devote himself to peace with the city and its emperor. Its emperor was a man 27 years older than Mehmed, aptly named Constantine XI. He had the unenviable task of taking the Byzantine throne 2 years earlier. He was 44 years old, and he had been fighting wars for 20 years. He was a hard, practical man, relatively unconcerned with the religious nuance that permeated the city. He was acquainted with the sting of defeat as well, already losing a war and territory to Mehmed's father, where 60,000 Byzantines were enslaved, and Constantine was forced to declare the city a vassal of the Ottomans. Constantine's first wife died childless. His second wife also tragically died childless. He made several attempts to secure dynastic marriages with the hopes of producing an heir and possibly gain an ally or two, but every single attempt fell through. His unfortunate personal life was compounded by the disastrous situation of the throne he found himself inheriting. He had a high admiral of the navy, but no fleet of ships. He had a commander-in-chief, but almost no soldiers. Roger Crowley describes the situation well when he says, quote, "Within the Lilliputian world of the court, the nobility jostled and squabbled for absurdly pretentious titles such as the Grand Domestic, the Grand Chancellor, or Lord of the Imperial Wardrobe. Constantine was effectively an emperor without power. His territory had shrunk to the city and its suburbs, a few islands, and linked dominions in the Peloponnese." End quote. Constantine's ascension was never fully legitimized either. There was a dispute for the throne with his brother, and Constantine won out because Murad, Sultan of the Ottomans, preferred him over his brother. Because of this messy passing of the royal baton, and to prevent the people from rioting over the circumstances, he broke a long-held tradition of never being crowned in the Hagia Sophia. Inside the city, he had very little control of affairs. The Venetians owned the banking and commerce markets and operated completely independent of the throne. The Ottomans too had commercial interests in the city that were likewise outside the emperor's influence. The city was so weak, so unable to project power, that any Ottoman who so desired could sail across the Bosphorus and march right up to the walls of Theodosius, but alas, they still had no means to breach them. Now, Mehmed, the Sultan, was a very shrewd man, and up to this point he had shown himself to be seeking peace with the Greeks, but he knew well the weakened state of the city. Behind the scenes he had been drawing up a plan for its fall. Some say he was obsessed with the thought that he had been planning its demise since he was 13 years old, to remove the bone in the throat of Allah. As Byzantium noted Mehmed's forward-leaning military posturing, they could all but confirm this obsession. All Mehmed needed was an excuse to proclaim his desire openly, and it didn't take long for Constantine to oblige. Within the city, the emperor held a man named Orhan as a sort of mutual prisoner who was a rival claimant to the Ottoman throne. His sustenance and lifestyle were paid for by the Ottomans, as keeping him held up was the lesser of two evils. But short on money, Constantine sent emissaries that demanded Mehmed increase the stipend of this man's lifestyle, as it was beyond the means that they were providing. And if Mehmed did not comply, he would release him. Constantine was betting that out of fear of an Ottoman civil war, he would happily cough up a few extra bucks. But it was a fundamental miscalculation of the man that Mehmed was. One of his officials who received Constantine's message responded, quote, "You stupid Greeks, I have had enough of your devious ways. The late Sultan was a lenient and conscientious friend to you. The present Sultan is not of the same mind. If Constantine eludes his bold and imperious grasp, it will only be because God continues to overlook your cunning and wicked schemes. You are fools to think that you can frighten us with your fantasies, and that when the ink on our treaty is barely dry. We are not children without strength or reason. If you think you can start something, do so. If you want to proclaim Orhan as Sultan in Thrace, go ahead. If you want to bring the Hungarians across the Danube, let them come. If you want to recover the places which you lost long since, try it. But know this, you will make no headway in any of these things. All that you will achieve is to lose what little you still have." End quote. Mehmed capitalized on this diplomatic faux pas to justify a massive fortress-building campaign along the Bosphorus, but not in Anatolia, the Ottoman side of the strait. No, these were for the first time on the European side. The fortress closest to the city he named the Throat Cutter. Its strategic mission would be to strangle what life remained in Constantinople's economy by blockading any and all imports and exports. When construction began, Constantine sent messengers to Mehmed, letting him know that he was breaking a signed treaty by such actions. But Mehmed replied, quote, "What the city contains is its own. Beyond the fosse, it has no dominion, owns nothing. If I want to build a fortress at the Sacred Mouth, it can't forbid me. Go away and tell your emperor this. The Sultan who now rules is not like his predecessors. What they couldn't achieve, he can do so easily and at once. The things that they do not wish to do, he certainly does. The next man to come here on a mission like this will be flayed alive." End quote. Constantine, who could see the busy construction on the horizon from the height of the towers of Constantinople, simply had no way of stopping Mehmed's desires. Churches and monasteries nearby the new building sites were razed by Ottomans for raw materials. Local Greek villages were raided for food, and when the workmen of the fields attempted to stop the Ottomans, they were massacred. When Constantine received news of what was happening to his people outside his walls, he sent one final message to Mehmed. Quote, "Since you have preferred war to peace, and I can call you back to peace with neither oaths nor pleas, then follow your own will. I take refuge in God. If he has decreed and decided to hand this city over to you, who can contradict him or prevent it? If he instills the idea of peace in your mind, I would gladly agree. For the moment, now that you have broken the treaties, which I am bound by oath, let these be dissolved. Henceforth, I will keep the city gates closed. I will fight for the inhabitants with all my strength. You may continue in your power until the righteous judge passes sentence on each of us." End quote. Mehmed's response was brief and revealing. Quote, "Either surrender the city or stand ready to do battle." End quote. The Throat Cutter, the fortress designed personally by Mehmed, was completed on August 31st, 1452. A sympathetic Venetian sea captain attempted to sail past the Throat Cutter to supply the city, but he was shot through with cannon. The survivors were beheaded, and the captain himself was impaled through his anus. Constantine sent out a flurry of dispatches to all of Christendom, begging, pleading for help against the enemy on their doorstep, to his own kin in southern Greece who commanded armies of their own, to the king of Hungary, to kings in Italy, to all the monarchies of Western Europe, even to the Pope himself. He promised gifts of land to any and all that would send forth armies, but none responded with any practical needs. So now we come to the big Christian elephant in the room. I've been postponing discussing this point up until now to stay focused on the timeline and the narrative, but the question must now be addressed. Why didn't the Latin Church or any of its powerful kings come to the aid of the Byzantines? They certainly had a common enemy in an ascending Islamic empire. The Muslim sultans themselves believed that once Constantinople fell, all of Europe would be wide open for conquest. It all goes back to a long history of theological disputes over the course of hundreds of years that boiled over in a mutual excommunication of the Pope in the west and the Patriarch of Constantinople in the east. To summarize the dispute, as far as I understand it, the Byzantines generally scoffed at the Pope's assertion of having total authority over their patriarch, not to mention over all the earth. But the real rub was that the Byzantines omitted a small phrase from the Nicene Creed, the word filioque, meaning "and from the Son." Their omission, according to Western theologians, presumed a heretical understanding of the nature of the Holy Trinity, of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. It may seem like a small issue to our modern ecumenical sensibilities towards religion today, but as Roger Crowley says, quote, "Such issues were the stuff of riots in Constantinople," end quote. Constantine, however, was a soldier, not a theologian, and therefore cast his lot in with those who sought unification with Rome as a pragmatic means to save the city. Many Byzantine bishops, and even the Patriarch himself, were in favor of such reunification. They all saw their way of life as dying, choking on the desert sands of the East, and the only means to worldly salvation was through this reconciliation with Rome. Get back in the Latin Church's favor, and she might send forth her armies. But the citizens of Constantinople and much of the lower-level clergy did not care much for pragmatism when considering their eternal souls. As the city's leadership pushed for unification, many commoners took to omitting their emperor and their patriarch in their daily prayers. The patriarch eventually became so fed up with his flock that he left Constantinople altogether and moved to Rome, perhaps also hoping to influence the pontiff. Monks and nuns took to the streets proclaiming that the city neither wanted nor needed Latin help or Latin union, and that they finally be rid of the worship of the unleavened. And yet, Constantine somehow managed to secure promises of Western aid by conducting a unification ceremony, a Latin Rite Mass at the Hagia Sophia on December 12, 1452. Now, this Latin Rite of Mass would have been utterly unrecognizable to most Greeks who were accustomed to their divine liturgy rite. It was entirely foreign, and the bread used for the consecration was unleavened, a heresy to the Orthodox faithful. And worse, their own patriarch was absent for the ceremony. Though unification was declared, the people refused to attend Latin sacraments, and the promise of Western aid never even materialized. Constantine had placed too much hope in the papacy by assuming it had far more control over the Western kingdoms than it actually did. Afterward, a Byzantine theologian posted a manifesto on the doors of one of the churches, quote, "Wretched Romans, how you have been led astray! You have departed from hope, which rests in God, by trusting the power of the Franks. As well as the city itself, which will soon be destroyed, you have lost the true religion." End quote. For Mahmed, who was monitoring the situation closely, he was relieved. Unification and a host of Frankish knights was the last thing that he needed. And as the old city sank into the depths of winter, and 1452 transitioned to 1453, an unusual amount of earthquakes rumbled through its foundations, and unseasonal torrential rain battered and flooded the streets. Supplies were drying up. When Constantine rode out amongst his people, they jeered and ridiculed him openly. But the old soldier emperor was determined to save the city despite its hatred towards him. He sent out foraging parties to find food. He repaired neglected defenses badly in need of attention. Many buildings were ordered destroyed to be used as raw material for the city walls. Garrisons were established, arms were collected and consolidated. He even daringly sent out some of his galleys to plunder Ottoman shores for food. Miraculously, a Venetian ship carrying around 1,000 professional experienced soldiers made it past the throat cutter to help organize the city's defenses. The city, Constantinople, was preparing for the fight of its life. Ever it had lived in the shadow of the East, of siege warfare, and had somehow survived. It had seen plagues and earthquakes. It had once ruled the world. Yet it was crumbling in on itself, and its enemies lurked as a predator circles wounded prey. But the old city still had one asset that Mahmed, for all his thought bent on the city's destruction, had yet to conceive how. How was he going to breach the city walls, the walls of Theodosius, the walls of Constantinople, the walls that every siege weapon of the past 1,000 years had been summoned to destroy? Catapults, ladders, mines, battering rams, tunnels, all had failed. How would he do the one thing that Islam had been dreaming of since the Prophet, the one thing that so many sultans and warlords before him had failed to do? How would he capture the red apple? It's now time to bring forward the true subject of this episode, a Hungarian iron founder and engineer known only as Orban. Now, there's virtually no information on Orban's origins. The fact that he came from Hungary is really just historians' best guess. What is known about Orban is that he possessed a special talent, a deadly skill, in fact. Orban could forge really, really big cannons. Gunpowder had been in Europe for about 50 years or so now, and iron founders were still perfecting the forge craft of cannonry. Despite their infancy, cannons had already seen battle, sometimes with notable effect, though often the effect was more psychological than tactical. The Ottomans had already tried using cannons against the massive walls of the city, but the stone balls simply bounced off or shattered like waves on rock. Constantinople even had a few cannons in some of its towers on the wall, but the difference between the Ottomans and the Byzantines when it came to this new technology was that the Ottomans were investing in it and improving the technology. The Byzantines simply didn't have the money for research and development. Sometime, probably around early 1452, Orban arrives at Constantinople seeking an audience with the emperor. He tells the emperor that he can build him state-of-the-art cannons, cast from solid bronze, and capable of handling the immense pressure and the heat needed for the largest calibers desired. The story goes that Constantine desperately wanted to employ Orban, but he possessed neither the material for him to build with, nor the money to pay him for his service. The best the broke emperor could do was give him a stipend to keep him inside the city and out of Ottoman hands. But the stipend was irregular and of little value anyway, and rethinking his prospects for success in the city, Orban left and headed for the capital of the Ottoman Empire. There, Sultan Mehmed welcomed him and showered him with lavish clothes and more food than he would ever need. It's said that Mehmed asked the metalsmith if he could build a cannon large enough to smash the walls of the city. Orban is said to have replied that, quote, "If you want, I can cast a cannon of bronze with the capacity of the stone you want. I have examined the walls of the city in great detail. I can shatter to dust not only these walls with the stones from my guns, but the very walls of Babylon itself." End quote. I already mentioned that the Ottomans had been forging their own cannons prior to Orban's arrival, but what he brought was a new skill set to the mix. He was a master craftsman who knew how to work with large molds, and he understood the heat tolerances of these weapons. From clay, hemp, and linen, a mold was cast 30 feet deep into the ground. Massive furnaces were constructed that can sustain 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. A traveler who witnessed the Ottoman cannon foundry said, quote, "On the day when the cannon are to be cast, the masters, foremen, and founders, together with the Grand Master of the artillery, the chief overseer, the imam, the muezzin, and the timekeeper, all assembled to the cries of Allah, Allah, and the wood is thrown into the furnace. After these have been heated for 24 hours, the founders and stokers strip naked, wearing nothing but their slippers, and an odd kind of cap which leaves nothing but their eyes visible, and thick sleeves to protect the arms. For after the fire has been alit in the furnace for 24 hours, no person can approach on account of the heat, save he be attired in the above manner. Whoever wishes to see a good picture of the fires of hell should witness this sight." End quote. And to add insult to injury, captured Byzantine church bells were added to the melting scraps of bronze. For 3 days and nights, the bellows superheated the forge fires, finally spewing out the red-hot liquid metal that flowed into the cast, filling it up and solidifying into a creation that was described as, quote, "a horrifying and terrible monster," end quote. What emerged was indeed a monster, a 27-foot-long cannon with 8-inch thick solid bronze walls. The diameter of the gun was 30 inches, and it was theoretically capable of firing boulders weighing over half a ton. All in all, the giant gun took 3 months to complete. I say theoretically because at this point Orban still hasn't proven his worth. He made a giant gun, but does it work? Mehmed, too, wanted to know, and immediately ordered the gun to a large plain where it could be safely test-fired. The blast was heard 10 miles away. The boulder was hurled a mile through the air and lodged itself 6 feet into the ground. And Mehmed, the Sultan, made sure that news of this weapon reached Constantinople. The gun was mobilized by a team of hundreds of men and 60 oxen who dragged the monster at a rate of 2.5 miles a day, but each mile brought it closer to Constantinople, 140 miles away. In the meantime, Orban was commissioned to keep building cannons. The Ottomans were experts in raising armies. They were masters of resource logistics and managing huge numbers of men. A European prisoner among them remembered, quote, "When recruiting for the army has begun, they gather with such readiness and speed that you might think they are invited to a wedding, not a war. They gather within a month, in the order that they are summoned, the infantrymen separately from the cavalrymen, and all of them with their appointed chiefs in the same order which they use for encampments and when preparing for battle. With such enthusiasm, the men put themselves forward in the place of their neighbors, and those left at home feel an injustice has been done to them. They claim they will be happier if they die on the battlefield among the spears and arrows of the enemy than at home. Those who die in war like this are not mourned, but hailed as saints and victors, to be set as an example and given high respect." End quote. When the Turkish men found out that the city itself was the goal, they were so enthusiastic that multitudes who had not been called showed up to march with Mehmed. Now with these additional volunteers, the young Sultan's force of professional cavalry, of farmer-class infantry, and even Christian men from the Balkans had swollen to hundreds of thousands strong. In February of 1453, the first group of Ottomans begins arriving in the lands on the outskirts of Constantinople to clear out any outposts that might give the main body some trouble. On Friday, March 23rd, Mehmed set out from his capital in Turkey, quote, "with all his army, cavalry, and infantry, traveling across the landscape, devastating and disturbing everything, creating fear and agony and the utmost horror wherever he went." End quote. On April 1st, 1453, the people of the city arose to find an Ottoman army once again at its gates, once again threatening their very existence. It was also Easter Sunday. Mehmed's army began the busy work of literally digging in for a siege, raising ramparts, carving ditches, and felling trees. Before long, an entire city of tents had arisen before the walls of Theodosius. Each group of tents held high the banner signifying their region and locality. Perhaps, for the Byzantines, the most disheartening banner to see outside its walls was that of the Europeans among the enemy. Quote, "As sunset approached, the call to prayer would rise in a sinuous thread of sound above the tents from the dozens of points as the muezzins called the men to prayer. Campfires would be lit for the one meal of the day, for the Ottoman army campaigned frugally, and smoke drifted in the wind. A bare 250 yards from their citadel, they could catch the purposeful sounds of camp activity, the low murmur of voices, the hammering of mallets, the sharpening of swords, the snorting and braying of horses, mules, and camels. And far worse, they could probably make out the fainter sound of Christian worship from the European wing of the army. For an empire intent on holy war, the Ottomans ruled their vassals with remarkable tolerance." End quote. Most estimates are 200,000 strong for the Ottomans, but no one really knows for sure. Each source varies pretty wildly. But Constantine had no trouble calculating the size of his army. He could easily count them. 8,000 men. 8,000 men to defend the entire city and its 12 miles of perimeter walls. When he received the reports of his army's strength, he kept that information strictly confidential so as not to cause hopelessness within the already fearful ranks. Instead, he ordered all the banners of the city to be raised high, and his soldiers to march along the wall in full view of the citizens and the enemy. Mehmed sent forth a parley party to the gates of the city with the message that either every citizen in the city converts to Islam or pay a tax to live as vassals of the Ottoman Empire. That, per Quranic law, if one of these choices is agreed upon, all may live and the city will not be plundered. But the city replied with the same reply that it had issued for hundreds of years prior. Quote, "We accept neither the tax, nor Islam, nor the capitulation of our fortress." End quote. And at this, Mehmed ordered Orban's big guns to be hauled to the front. Constantine remained in public view, hearing mass among his people and handing out orders himself. But before any fuse was lit, or stone hurled, or catapult launched, an ominous earthquake began rumbling below the city, and a heavy rainstorm opened above. In its great churches, it was rumored that the icons of Byzantium began sweating. Getting Orban's gun in place was no small task. They weren't actually in position to fire until April 6th. The big cannon was set with the smaller cannons arranged on either side of it, and this formation was affectionately referred to by the Ottomans as the bear and her cubs. All in all, Mehmed by this time had 69 cannons, with a mobile foundry working to cast more. As the cannons were being readied, Mehmed had his mining team working to dig tunnels under the city walls, and another group was casting debris onto the moat with the hopes of being able to cross it. At night, brave Byzantines would venture out from behind the walls and attack these projects to disrupt their operations. Simultaneously, some of the older Ottoman cannons began firing at the Great Walls but had little effect. But before long, Orban's super cannon was ready for its world debut. When Orban was confident that he had done all he could, he signaled to the Sultan that his cannon was ready. And at last the fuse was lit, and what followed was described by one of the Ottoman engineers. Quote, "When it had caught fire, faster than you can say it, there was at first a terrifying roar and a violent shaking of the ground beneath, and for a great distance around, and a din such had never been heard. Then, with a monstrous thundering and an awful explosion, and a flame that illuminated everything around and about and scorched it, the wooden wad was forced out by the hot blast of dry air, and propelled the stone ball powerfully out. Projected with an incredible force and power, the stone struck the wall, which it immediately shook and demolished, and it was itself shattered into many fragments, and the pieces were hurled everywhere, dealing death to those standing nearby." End quote. Archbishop Leonard, watching from within the city, said, quote, "They pulverized the wall with it, and although it was extremely strong, it collapsed under the bombardment of this appalling device." End quote. Following the super cannon shot, the Cubs began exploding their projectiles towards the city walls, and cannon after cannon was lit and fired, creating a ceaseless, soul-shaking roar outside the city. The smoke hung thick enough to nearly obscure the two peoples from each other. Entire sections of the wall's towers, parapets, and barracks came crashing down. Other cannons were aimed up and over the wall to send boulders ripping through the city's churches and homes. Trebuchets were also employed to fling at high arc stones nearly straight up into the air, which came hurtling down through the roofs of the imperial palace, smashing it apart. The concussions of the cannon blasts, the heavy smoke, the sulfuric smell, all of it terrified the defenders who had never seen or heard anything like it before. Most of the citizenry fled to the churches, where they fell upon their knees before their sacred icons, begging for their intercession, for heaven not to abandon the city. Out of desperation, Constantine ordered all the church bells to be rung throughout the city to offer some semblance of unity and hope and defiance. The Byzantine defenders dusted off their largest cannon to fire back at the Ottomans, but it exploded into pieces nearly as soon as they ignited the fuse due to poor upkeep and even poorer craftsmanship. Remember that these weapons are still less than 50 years old for most of these people. So new, in fact, that the Greek language hadn't yet come up with a name for them. Crowley notes that the Greek historians struggled with different figures of speech to describe what cannons were and what they do. The one they used, that I like best, is takers of cities. Orban's taker of cities was proving to be a massive success. Before the Ottomans' very eyes, the bone in the throat of Allah was crumbling to the ground. But these primitive cannons did have their complications. The biggest threat to their ability to operate was heat. The big gun took so long to reset that it could only be fired 7 times a day. With hours in between uses, the drastic heat and cooling cycles were stressing the bronze. At each inspection of the weapon, Orban grew more and more concerned with his creation. He could begin to see the hairline fractures emerging from the impurities of the metal, so he ordered it bathed in hot olive oil to prevent the cool air from entering the cracks. But the expert craftsman's eye was too sharp to be taken by surprise. He knew his weapon was exceeding its mandate and becoming dangerous, very dangerous to use, and he asked Mehmed to withdraw the gun from service and let him recast it anew. Mehmed refused, dismissed Orban's concerns, and ordered it to fire again. Orban personally oversaw the reloading and resetting, and when it was ready to fire, he asked the Sultan to stand back as he wasn't sure what would happen. The fuse was lit, and as the ember traced its way to the gunpowder chamber within the cannon, Orban held his breath, but he didn't have to hold it for too long. His super gun, the gun of destiny, the taker of cities, that brought down in a single moment walls that had repelled everything thrown at it for 1,000 years, had exploded, unable to contain its own firepower. In a single blinding flash, the hairline cracks had fractured into 1,000 pieces, sending shards of bronze and stone and white-hot fire in every direction. After the smoke had cleared, most of the cannon's engineering team lay dead, including its creator, Orban. Mehmed had lost his expert cannon forger, killed by his own monstrosity, and despite the relentless bombardment, the Byzantines were unbelievably effective at rebuilding the walls just as fast as they fell. Theirs is a resiliency that's hard to comprehend, but despite their tenacity, the ship was sinking faster than they could bail out water. On May 24th, the moon rose with a partial lunar eclipse, and it was taken as a horrifying omen for the Byzantines, for in the sky, looking down upon the beleaguered defenders, was the crescent moon of the Ottomans. Even Constantine, who relied on his soldiers' pragmatism, was deeply concerned with the sign in the heavens. He ordered a direct appeal to the Virgin Mary that she may intercede on their behalf to save them from their enemies. Crowds gathered at the shrine of her icon, the Hadagetria, thought to be painted by St. Luke himself. It was lifted on a post and led in a grand procession through the city. Robed priests, laity, men, women, children, all followed behind. Incense filled the air as the procession passed, and cantors led the way, singing, quote, "Do thou save thy city, as thou knowest and willest. We put thee forward as our arms, our rampart, our shield, our general. Do thou fight for thy people." End quote. But then, for a people already steeped in a culture of signs and omens, calamity happened. It's recorded that the icon inexplicably fell from the hands of its bearers and slammed into the mud. The people rushed to lift it up, but it seemed as though it was fastened to the ground. The men gripped and heaved, but none could budge it. And what must have seemed like an eternity, the icon finally dislodged, and as they worked to continue the procession, thunder and lightning tore open the sky, and a torrential downpour of rain battered the city again. It rained so hard that a flood formed and ripped through the streets, threatening to carry people away in its fury. The procession was scattered. Another omen, but it wouldn't be the last. Over the next few days, a black fog was said to descend upon the city, and a strange light was seen to be occupying and moving about the dome of the Hagia Sophia for an entire night, before it eventually darted up and disappeared into the clouds. Many of the Greeks determined that this was, in fact, the Holy Ghost, finally leaving the city to its fate. According to Crowley, the Ottomans also witnessed the strange lights and were equally confused. Today, the best worldly guess we have for these strange phenomena, apart from tricks of the brain, are atmospheric anomalies caused by a volcanic eruption in Australia that may have potentially coincided with the siege of Constantinople, but nobody really knows. Finally, after 53 days of bombardment, on Tuesday, May 29th, 1453, the Ottoman soldiers breached the city. There are two accounts of what Constantine did when he saw the Muslim soldiers marching through the streets of the city of his namesake. One is that he cast aside his purple regalia, and he led a final charge against the enemy, perishing in a glorious death as a common soldier alongside the men who served him. Another, however, says that he hanged himself, and I just don't think we'll ever really know the truth of his fate. Roger Crowley quotes Greek scholar Michael Critobulus, who Crowley notes is generally Ottoman-friendly, who personally witnessed the scene. Quote, "Women were dragged violently from their bedchambers. Children were snatched from their parents. Old men and women who were unable to flee their houses were slaughtered mercilessly, along with the weak-minded, the old, the lepers, the infirm. The newborn babies were hurled into the squares. Women and boys were raped. The ill-assorted groups of captives were tied together by their captors, dragging them out savagely, driving them, tearing at them, manhandling them, herding them off disgracefully and shamefully into the crossroads, insulting them, and doing terrible things." End quote. Once the people had been wrangled, the pillaging could begin. Crowley continues, quote, "The miracle-working icon of the Hadagetria was hacked into 4 pieces and divided among the soldiers for its valuable frame. Crosses were smashed from the roofs of churches. The tombs of saints were cracked open and searched for treasure. Their contents were torn to pieces and thrown into the street. The church treasures, Chalices, goblets, and holy artifacts in precious and sumptuous robes, embroidered with much gold and glittering with precious stones and pearls, were carried away and melted down. The altars were torn down, and the walls of churches and sanctuaries were ransacked, looking for gold. The consecrated images of God's saints witnessed scenes of rape, according to Leonard. Entering the convents, nuns were led to the Fleet and ravished. The monks were killed in their cells, or hauled out of the churches where they had sought sanctuary, and driven away with insults and dishonor. The tombs of the emperors were smashed open with iron bars in search of hidden gold. These, and 10,000 other terrible things were done, Critobulus mournfully recorded. In a few hours, 1,000 years of Christian Constantinople largely disappeared. End quote. After 3 days of looting, Mehmed walked the city, and upon seeing the rubble, the blood, the faces of the enslaved and the ravaged, he was said to have been brought to tears, saying, quote, "What a city we have given over to plunder and destruction." End quote. Mehmed, who at this point was only 21 years old, transferred the capital of his empire to his new prized city. And if you ignore the plunder of the city, he was very lenient to the inhabitants who remained. They could reclaim some of their possessions, they were generally treated as equals, and their worship could also continue, just not in the Hagia Sophia, for that was to be transformed into a grand mosque. Most historians agree that the fall of the city marked the official end of the Roman Empire, a state of government that had dated back to 27 BC and lasted nearly 1,500 years. Western Europe was forever changed too. Their age of crusading came to a crashing halt, as no king of the West would dare challenge the power that had risen in the East. Mainland Europe now lay open to the Ottomans without them having to worry about a host of European allies marching up from behind. The takers of cities had significant consequences too. As long as recorded human history has existed, large stone city walls had proved an almost insurmountable obstacle for attackers. Sieges were not a guaranteed tactic, and often ended in disaster for the one doing the sieging. Every city built after Constantinople modeled on it their own defenses. But now everything has changed. As Crowley puts it, quote, "For the first time since trumpets flattened the walls of Jericho, a significant advantage was handed back to the side besieging a stoutly fortified castle." End quote. No city was safe any longer. No people could shut up their gates and pray that the enemy out there gives up and moves on to easier plunder. The future of gunpowder as a primary weapon of war was cemented in 1453 when the walls of Constantinople came tumbling down. As news of the fall spread, there was some outrage in Europe, mostly impotent talk of retaking the city and conquering the Ottomans. But soon, the Protestant Reformation turned Western Europe upside down, and the retaking of Constantinople was quickly forgotten. A little bit of gunpowder and a man who knew what it was for brought about a clear demarcation in our history books for the end of the medieval period, the end of that mythological grand romance, the end of walled cities, the end of a great Christian kingdom in the East. Gunpowder was the final straw atop a Byzantine world that was already collapsing under its own weight, and to be trampled underfoot by the ascendancy of the Ottoman Empire. Europe did benefit in one way from the fall of Constantinople, however. Massive waves of wayward Greek immigrants found their way to Western Europe to start a new life. As it was in Byzantium, their culture was rich and vivid. They brought with them their poets, writers, scribes, lecturers, musicians, astronomers, architects, academics, philosophers, scientists, politicians, theologians, any and every kind of artist of the day. With them, they brought the sum total of accumulated knowledge and beauty that was Byzantium. These artists sparked a cultural revival in ancient Greece and Rome. They were the seeds of the European Renaissance. When the Ottoman armies reached the Hagia Sophia and gazed upon the statue of Justinian holding the red apple of their dreams, the globe topped with a cross that symbolically endowed Byzantium with the authority to march forward with faith alone, it was here, Crowley says, where Constantinople truly fell, when they entered the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Quote, "If there is a precise moment when Byzantium could said to have died, it is now with the final blow of an axe. The Hagia Sophia had witnessed many of the great dramas of the imperial city. A church had stood on the site for 1,100 years, the great church of Justinian for 900. The mighty building had reflected and had lived the turbulent spiritual and secular life of the city. Every emperor, with the ominous exception of the last, had been crowned here. Many of the defining dramas of the empire had been played out under the great dome, suspended by heaven by a golden chain. Blood had been spilled on its marble floors before. Riots had taken place. Patriarchs and emperors had taken sanctuary from mobs and plotters or had been dragged from it by force. 3 times the dome had collapsed in earthquakes. Its imposing doorways had seen papal legates march in with their bull of excommunication. Vikings had carved graffiti on its walls. Barbarian Frankish crusaders had pillaged it mercilessly. It was here that the whole population of Russia had been converted to Christianity as a result of the unearthly beauty of the Orthodox liturgy. Here, too, that the great religious controversies had been played out, and ordinary people had worn the floors smooth with their feet and their prayers. The history of the Church of the Holy Wisdom was the reflection of Byzantium, sacred and profane, mystical and sensuous, beautiful and cruel, irrational, divine, and human. And after 1,123 years and 27 days, it was nearly over. There are some theories out there that Orban survived the siege and lived to tell about it, but the story of him dying beside his taker of cities seems to be the most agreed upon fate for him. It's certainly the most poetic. If you're wondering why I picked O Fortuna as the bumper music for this episode, the song is based off an old medieval poem about the turning of the wheels of fate. I highly recommend looking up the lyrics. They're the perfect thematic element for the cataclysmic events in this episode. Plus, it's just such a wonderfully epic and foreboding piece. If you enjoyed this episode and have a special interest in this topic, do go and pick up a copy of Roger Crowley's book. It's called 1453, The War for Constantinople and the Clash of Islam in the West. It's an awesome, awesome read. There are also a couple of other history podcasts that may be of interest to you in this arena. One is an oldie but a goodie, 12 Byzantine Rulers by Lars Brownworth. It's packed full of information on the Eastern Empire. And it's not an active podcast anymore, but it's well worth a listen. I think he also has a book and a blog on the subject, and I'll see if I can link to those in the show transcripts. Another is current. It's called the Hellenistic Age podcast. Derek over there has been going strong for a few years now, and he has quite the cache of episodes for you to dive into. He does an awesome job, and I'll be sure also to make sure there's a link to his podcast in the transcripts. I also need to thank my sister Courtney for her awesome cover art that she always produces for the show. If you're in need of some freelance design, you can reach her at cjdejulius.myportfolio.com. If you feel my little podcast is worth $1, I'll gladly take that dollar. For $1 a month, you get glimpses of my behind-the-scenes research and content, plus a shout-out on the next episode that I record. And what's more, you help me cover the expenses of this whole thing. So if you're willing and able, I'd really appreciate it. One more thing, if you could, I'd greatly appreciate a review and rating on wherever you listen. It really helps me out with exposure and just makes my day. Also, I love hearing from everybody, so feel free to reach me on the Written in Blood Facebook page, at my Twitter handle, at @sdejulius, or via email at steven.dejulius@gmail.com. And as always, thank you for listening to Written in Blood History. See you later.